I'm so glad you're here with us tonight for the second week in the study of Daniel. For those of you that are watching online, I'm extremely glad you're here with us. As we get started, I want to take a second and I just want to pray because we need God's help to be able to understand something so significant. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that we would get to see your heart. God, I know in Daniel chapter 2, you have something incredibly powerful for us in volatile times. God, if we can capture two truths from this passage, it will change everything. And we will go from people who are worried and nervous to people who are secure, people who know that there's a plan, and people who can trust the one who planned it. God, give us insight into this chapter. God, I also pray that you would help people to see past me and be able to connect with you. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen. Open up your Bibles, if you will, to Daniel chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 1. And like I prayed, there's a couple things that are super powerful. If we catch them, it'll change everything. I don't know about the rest of you, but whenever I start reading a passage, let's see, this is supposed to work. Is this battery dead? Oh, there it goes. Did this work or did you do it? What? Did this work or did you do it? Let's see. Okay, you must have to do it. So this must be dead. It's probably from Charlie using it. So go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to start with chapter 1. As you're reading chapter 1, I want to help you with something because as you go through the book of Daniel, you are going to read things that don't make sense. You're going to read things that you don't quite understand. You're going to read, if you read any other kind of commentaries or anything like that, people are going to confuse you and say some incredibly difficult things. I want to take about a 2-minute sidetrack on the very first sentence. In the second year of his reign, it's talking about King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And in the second year of his reign, if you know the rest, and if you were with us last week, and if you've read Jeremiah and you read other passages about this particular situation, it doesn't make sense to you because you're starting to go, the second year of his reign. And some people believe that Daniel didn't actually write the book, and this is one of the main complaints they have, is there's no possible way, because we know that there was a 3-year plan in chapter 1, and then all of a sudden in the second year, it's like something doesn't make any sense. What I want to give you is a tool that I have that really helps me. Whenever I come across something that I don't understand at first, what I do is kind of put it into my theological refrigerator. And as I put it in the refrigerator, here's what I do. God, I don't know exactly what that means yet, but you're going to be able to help me figure it out, and someday I'm going to come across an explanation that's going to make sense, and I'll be able to trust you. So as we look in chapter 2, people say that there's no possible way. It's the second year of his reign, so Daniel couldn't have written it. But if you understand anything about the way Babylonians numbered things, and if you understand a little bit about history, so you see Nebuchadnezzar, he was in the second year of his reign, and I'll show you how, okay? He reigned along with his father when his father was alive. He went, and his father and him were co-reigning together, and then he was the one that went out and did all of the battles, brought everyone in, and then his father died. And the way Babylonians keep track of it is they don't keep track of the first year. So anytime you start in the first year, they consider that to be the inaugural year. So that year doesn't count. So it would be 605 when he started to become king by himself. Then 604 when they started counting. And then the second year was 603, which just happens to be perfect timing for after chapter 1. Daniel had gone through 3 years of training, and then now all of a sudden something really important happens in chapter 2. And we're going to get to that. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. I love how it's plural because he had all kinds of dreams. But there was one dream in particular that just stressed him out of his mind, okay? Imagine this, and this is kind of ironic, that the most powerful person in the world, the one that has power, wealth, influence, and control over everyone else, doesn't have something that all of us long for. He doesn't have peace. He is not able to go to sleep at night. And here's this king stressed out of his mind by this dream. Watch what happens. Verse 2. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. So he has this dream and he can't figure it out, and it's super stressful, and we have to go all the way to verse 36 to find out what was in the dream. Okay? When they came in and they stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me. Literally, this dream stresses me out of my mind. I can hardly even handle what's going on. That's how upset he was by this dream. He said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me. I want to know what it means. Wow, you're on top of it. Good job. Then the astrologers answered the king, may the king live forever. And I love how these guys go into him and they say, hey, may you live forever. It's kind of a really polite way of sucking up. Okay, tell your servants the dream. See, here's King Nebuchadnezzar, and he is immediately on top of it. He says, I need you to tell me the dream. And if you tell it to us, we'll interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, this is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I love this because he goes right to the punishment. I will cut you into pieces and I will turn your houses into rubble. I mean, this guy's not messing around. Either you tell me the dream or I'm cutting you up and I'm turning your houses into complete rubble. Go ahead in the next one. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Here's how it worked back in those days. What they did is Babylonians were famous for having dreams and for interpreting dreams. And that's how they believed their God spoke to them. And they would do all kinds of occult practices. And then they would go to sleep and then they would dream. And then what they would do is they would tell the people that were the astrologers, the futurists, the magicians, the people that were into the occult, and then they would go to historical books. In fact, archaeologists have found multiple different books they had about how do you interpret dreams. And they would go to the books to try to understand what the dream was about. So the king would tell them the dream. They would go into the libraries, they would research, they'd find out about everything that happened, and then they would fill in the gaps themselves. But you see, King Nebuchadnezzar wasn't buying it. He wasn't going for it because he was so distressed by his dream. He wanted to know what the God said. He wanted to know someone who had authority because his dream terrified him. And in verse 36, we get to understand why it terrified him. So here's Nebuchadnezzar. He's saying, I don't want a pat answer. I don't want to know what the book says. I want to know that you are speaking so that I can understand the truth, because he is stressed out of his mind. The most powerful person on the planet is so stressed that he's saying, we're not going the normal channels. This is so important that in order for me to understand that you're not blowing smoke, that you're not just telling me what I want to hear, you're going to have to tell me the dream so I know that you can interpret it. And watch what happens. Once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dream and we'll interpret it. So here are these wise men, these occultists, these magicians, all of these people that are geared and trained in understanding a dream. They're completely helpless and they're clueless and there's nothing they can do. And they say, if you just tell us the dream, then we'll be able to tell you what it means. So there's a standoff. And I want you to kind of catch the tension is building because the king is getting more and more frustrated. He already came into the encounter stressed out of his mind. Verse 8. Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time because you realize this is what I firmly decided. I'm not changing my mind, and there's no way. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I just wanted to show you who the four groups of people were. They were scholars, futurists, sorcerers, and magi. It's the same word that we get in the Gospels for the magi at the early time when Jesus was coming. There were people that studied the charts. Go ahead, the next verse. If you do not tell me the dream. First, he starts by saying, if you tell me the dream, if you don't tell me the dream, I'm going to punish you and I'm going to cut you into pieces. I'm going to tear down your houses. And then he says, but I'll give you rewards. I'll give you all kinds of money. I'll give you all kinds of fame. Now, he's tired of that. Here's what he gets to. He says, if you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. I can imagine the situation. Nebuchadnezzar is stressed and he is important. And these guys don't have an answer. And there's nothing they can do about it. All of their wisdom, all of their studies have not prepared him for something that happens in this moment. And I want you to think about it for a second, because sometimes there are not intellectual answers to what's happening. Have you ever come across a situation where you just simply did not have an answer? You see, these people could not tell him what he had dreamed, and it was super stressful, and he kept up in the ante, and now he's about to tell them that I am giving you one last chance. Watch what he says. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. The astrologers answers the king. There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or astrologer. No other king has ever been as ridiculous and as narrow-minded as you are, and have focused on making us do something that is absolutely impossible. Now, we're about to come across two things that these astrologers, these occultists, these other people believed that helps us understand the Babylonians. One of them, I think, is completely true, and the other one is something that makes Daniel and his friends and us extremely different. What the king asks is too difficult. Here's what they say. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. And I totally agree with it. You know, there's some things that there are no answers unless God reveals it. There are some things that we simply cannot know by our own wisdom, by our own studies, by all of the things that we go to. I don't care how much education you get. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care about all of the different things that you do to prop yourself up. There are certain things that you cannot know on your own. You cannot know what another person has dreamed. You just simply cannot know it. And here's the thing that made them different than us. No one knows except for the gods. Watch this. And they do not live among humans. You see, they believed that the gods didn't trifle with normal people. They believed that the gods were so busy that they didn't interact with ordinary people like you and me. And the reason I want to slow down here is because I know there's some people in this room, and I know there'll be some people that are watching it online, that you believe that there's a God. But what you don't necessarily believe is that he cares about you, and that he will step in and help you. And these people are saying that we all know that the only way that this can get answered is if something outside of humanity steps in, and the gods don't care about us at all. Verse 12. This made the king so angry and infuriated. This made the king to the point where he was about to blow a complete gasket. And he said this, okay, if that's the case, if you won't tell me the dream, and if you try to make something up, I'm not putting up with it anymore. You are all going to die, and I'm going to get somebody else that can tell me the dream. Imagine how frustrated a king would have to be in order to get rid of all of his leaders and the highest elite groups in his world. Now, something is about to happen that is super interesting, and up until this time, we have Daniel, who has gone through the 3 years of the occult training. He's gone through all of the wisdom techniques. He's learned the literature of the Babylonians. He sat at the king table, but he hasn't been eating. Remember that? He's been eating just fruits and vegetables. And then all of a sudden, the king loses his temper and completely goes crazy. I want to talk to a couple of you before we move on. Has anybody ever had a boss that's kind of out of control? Have you ever been around someone who has been given positions of authority that do stuff that's just really dumb or out of what would be best, and you, as an innocent person, suffer the consequences? Here's Daniel. And here's his three friends. And remember, at the end of chapter 1, they had been elevated to where they were now part of the wise men. And because now they're in the in group, the wise men of the Babylonians, even though they're interns and they're not at the high level and they don't get called in for the big meetings, they are about to be killed themselves. Now here's Daniel. He is there, and all of a sudden this king goes crazy, loses his mind, gets so angry that he makes up a decree so that Daniel and his three friends will have to die. Watch this. And they made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death. And the men were sent to look for Daniel and his 3 friends to put them to death. There was an order to execute every single one of them. Can you imagine how intense Nebuchadnezzar was? You see, we get to read about all kinds of ways where he acted like this all throughout. If you want to just read some interesting stuff, one time he goes off and kills a Jewish king, read Jeremiah 29. But don't you wish that we knew exactly what the point was of a passage? You see, in our day, when we're reading and we're trying to understand something, we have several different ways to highlight the most important point. What we can do is we can make it in bold. We can make it in italics. We can underline it. We can set it off in a paragraph. There's so many ways today that we can highlight what's important. Don't you wish the Bible had something like that? Don't you wish the Bible would give us some clues so that we wouldn't have to read through the entire passage and we can know exactly how to narrow it down to the main point so we don't miss what's going on? You see, the reason I want to slow down and take some time is because not only does the Bible do that, but the Bible puts 3 specific hermeneutic principles together, literary devices to help us narrow down exactly what the main point is. The first one is when the Bible changes from prose to poetry, all of a sudden you know something really important is happening. All of a sudden you'll be reading the Bible and then the author will go into song and just start praising God. Or they'll change from a narrative to poetry. And here's what's about to happen in verse 17. So we get to see that, hey, something's different, something's happening. Another principle, a literary device that really helps us understand the main point, that we can catch it, is what I call the narrative arc. Now, if any of you have ever watched Hallmark, raise your hand. Okay, none of the guys will admit it, but if you've ever watched Hallmark, the plot's pretty similar. It's always the same. This is kind of how it works, okay? Usually the guy falls in love with the girl, okay? Then the guy does something extremely dumb so that the girl no longer trusts him or loves him anymore. And then all of a sudden, when you think everything's completely lost, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, something takes place and it changes everything. And then the hero gets the girl and then they sing together and everything is great and the movie ends. This is what happens throughout the scriptures too, and you get to see it too. A great story always has a narrative arc, and what happens in the arc is you think it's getting more and more and more tension, and all of a sudden the tension is so high you can't stand it anymore, and then something takes place to help you understand it. OCL, are you figuring that out? Does it work yet? Yes. Cool. Could I have it? Thank you. You are amazing and just a cool person. Okay, so the first thing is it changes from prose to poetry. The second thing is it's right at the edge of the crest of the narrative arc when everything is lost and Daniel's about to be killed. All of a sudden, something's going to be super important and super powerful. And then the last one, I want to take some time to help you. I'll just pretend like I'm hitting it, and then you just go to the next one, okay? Okay. So it's called chiasm or inverted parallelism. And the way it works is sometimes it's super simple. What happens is you start out with an A, and then on the other end there's another A, and then there's a B that comes closer and a B, and sometimes C is the main point. Sometimes it's more complicated. There's like an A, and then a farther A, and then a B, and then a farther B, and then a C, and then there's a D and a D, and in our text, there's all the way to E. But the way it works is it's like repeats the point, and it builds down to the arc, and it builds right down to the point or the edge so that we understand what's important. I know you can't read what I'm about to go to, so go to the next page. Okay, E, in chapter 2, verse 16, we get to see the main point of the text so that we understand exactly what the author is trying to get us to capture. Daniel uses chiasm, and you get a chance to read this. And the reason I want to take so much time is because next week in our homework, those of you that are going to do the homework for next week, at the end of each chapter, there's a page that says homework. And next week, you're going to read chapter 3. and there's some inverted parallelism, and I want you to understand it, that you have to be able to read it in there. And what I did is I gave you the verses for next week, and then I helped you understand where the main point is. Next week in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we get to find the main point where they come to confess something that's really true. And it's incredible what they confess. So next week, I want you to understand what's happening so you can catch it. Well, this week, it gets right down to the crucial tip of the point, and that's where we're about to go. So now that we understand that, we can see from 3 different ways Daniel's trying to make sure that we do not miss it, that we don't miss what's taking place. So now that we have all of that background, let's go to the next verse. When Arioch, the commander of the king guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, here's Daniel. And last week I told you about how Daniel responded, and there's some cool things we can learn. And I want to just point 4 things that Daniel did as he's going through that we can learn to emulate, okay? Daniel spoke to him. So the guy is about to kill him. He's about to find out he's going to be executed, and watch what happens. Daniel spoke to the guard with wisdom and tact. We're going to find about 9 or 10 times as we go through Daniel that Daniel responds with either respect or with wisdom or with tact or with gentleness or by treating other people with dignity even though they don't deserve it. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody told me that they were dragging me off to jail to kill me, I probably would have been pretty frustrated, pretty angry, pretty upset, but that is not how Daniel responded. And I think we're going to find out why in a few minutes, because Daniel knew something that we didn't know. We'll find out what that is in a minute. Daniel asked the king's officer, I love this, because if you want to find out what's going on, if you're married or in any other situation, it's usually a good idea to just ask questions and listen and try to understand what's really going on. Here's what Daniel did, verse 15. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Why in the world is Nebuchadnezzar acting even more crazy than he normally does? Watch what he says. He asked the king's officer, why did he do that? At this point, Daniel went to the king and asked for time. We already know that Daniel knew Nebuchadnezzar. Remember that Nebuchadnezzar went and interviewed him, and he said, and he found out that he was 10 times smarter than anyone else. So he brings Daniel in. Daniel says, hey, if you'll just give me some time, I will give you an answer. Okay, at this, Daniel went to the king, asked for time, so the king might interpret the dream for him. Go ahead and go to the next one. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are better known to most of you as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He urged them to plead for mercy from God. See, Daniel responded with wisdom and tact, and then he went and got the people that he knew the best to pray because they had a vested interest in it. Is that your normal response? Is your normal response to respond with wisdom and tact and then go and pray specifically about that matter? Oftentimes, I go to prayer probably about 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 down the road. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so he and his friends might not be executed. And I can imagine that prayer was intense. God, could you give us the mystery and help us understand it? Could you reveal something to us so we can catch what's really important so that we don't get executed? During the night, I love this, the mystery was revealed to Daniel. And I can imagine Daniel. He goes to sleep, and during his sleep, God reveals it to him, and he gets up in the morning, and he's going, yay, this is awesome. God revealed the dream to us. We're not going to die. Everything's really cool. And if Daniel would have been anything like me, he would have run right to the guy and said, okay, now that we got the understanding, we're going to go straight to the king. But that's not what Daniel did. And this is so important. Daniel praised the God of heaven. Let's keep going. And he said, praise be the name of God forever and ever. And then he goes into this prose so we can make sure we got the main point. Watch this. He says this, wisdom and power are his. Who are wisdom and powers? They belong to God. You see, here's Daniel thanking God for everything he's doing. And he's going to teach us something about how the world works. And the Bible wants to make sure that we don't miss what is so crucial, what is so important, that we desperately need to know, because if we know this, it'll change everything when we see what's happening around us. Watch this. He changes times and seasons. God does. He deposes kings and raises up other kings. Just want you to think about this. Does the sovereign God of the universe put the president in the office? Or do you think it happens against his will? I want you to kind of think about this, just process this. As we are on this great debate and people are stressed and nervous and people are worried about Supreme Court judges getting in and all kinds of stuff. And I'm not saying that all those things are not important, but I want you to make sure that we understand something. There is someone in charge of the people who think they're in charge. Watch this. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings. He raises up other. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. God gives wisdom to people who are already wise. You see, there's a difference between God's wisdom and the world's wisdom, and sometimes we need God's wisdom. I wish I had time to just take you to James chapter 3 and 4 so you could really unpack this. He reveals the deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells in him. God knew more about Nebuchadnezzar than Nebuchadnezzar knew about himself. He knows how the entire future world is going to be carried out. Man, I am so glad that he put to the point so we can catch this main stuff. It gets better. Not only does he thank God for giving him wisdom and giving him gifts and telling him how the world works, but he thanks him for listening to his prayer and giving him the ability to understand dreams and giving him the ability to be able to ask God and God speak to him. Before I move on, does God answer your prayers? Does God care about your situation? Does God reveal things to you that you could not know any other way by God? I wish I had time to take you to James and all kinds of other cool passages in the New Testament. It says that anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God. Let's keep going. I thank you and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. So they know what the king has said. All right, let's keep going. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon. Don't execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream, and I will tell him what it means. And the king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, I'm in verse 26, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? You remember him having this conversation and the tensions building? And all of a sudden, Daniel is not intimidated. Daniel's relaxed. And I can imagine when he comes to him and he walks in and the king says, okay, can you tell me the dream? Can you interpret it? Watch what Daniel does. Daniel replied, I love this. No wise man, enchanter, magician, diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked. No one on earth is able to give you what you want. And I bet he just paused. I bet he just waited. Watch what he does here. It's kind of cool. But there is a God in heaven. There is a God in heaven. This is absolutely foundational to the rest of Daniel because Daniel's going to give us about the future and how it unfolds. And we have to know before we get any of that revelation that there is a God in heaven and he reveals to people what they need to know, things that they cannot get on their own and they cannot get to through their own intellect. This gets really good. He has showed King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. And he tells him about his dream and he says to him, hey, you're about to go to sleep. You were dreaming and you're thinking about the future. And God answered your question about what was going to happen. I'm kind of going fast. Verse 29. Go back one. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come and the revealer of mysteries showed it to you. There is a God in heaven that is willing to reveal mysteries. But have you thought about how God chose to do it? Through an evil, angry king. Isn't God cool? Keep going. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because I have greater wisdom. You see, first Daniel answered with wisdom and tact. And then he prayed and got everyone else prayed. And then he took the time to pause and thank God. And then once he thanked God, he was humble and was willing to give God the credit. You see, we can learn a lot from Daniel, can't we? Instead of it being about us, which everyone else does, Daniel says, hey, only God knows, and I have nothing to do with it. It's not that I'm smarter, not that I have any other intellect, not that I'm more gifted than anyone else. It's because God knows, and he chose to reveal it to you. I'm skipping down, verse 31. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. He's about to tell him his dream. And Nebuchadnezzar is just saying, man, I hope this guy knows what he's talking about. Keep going. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron. And this is where it gets really scary in verse 34. You see, up until that time, there's just a statue, and it isn't even moving. And we only get to know about the first and the last part. We're going to have to go to chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 11 to be able to fill in all these details. But really, all he tells us about is the head, which is of gold, and which, by the way, next week, Nebuchadnezzar builds a 90-foot statue of gold. Nebuchadnezzar gets the point that he's the head of gold, and then he builds the statue. We're going to see what happens next week when that happens. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, and this is crucial, not by human hands. There was a rock cut out, and it wasn't cut out by human hands. And keep going. All of a sudden, something happens. The iron and the clay, the rock, the iron and the clay and the bronze, silver and the gold are all broken into pieces like chaff on the threshing floor. Every single part of the statue is going to be broken up and crushed, and then it's going to blow away to oblivion where it will be entirely and absolutely gone. No wonder it terrified him. No wonder here's this king seeing himself, and he had enough wisdom to know that I'm probably the statue. And all of a sudden, from heaven comes this rock, and it zeroes in, not on the head or the midsection or the arms or the legs, right on the feet of clay. That's where we get that phrase, by the way. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain, and it filled the entire earth. Keep going. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king, your majesty. You are the king of kings. I love how he talks with such respect to Nebuchadnezzar. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory, the exact same words in the Lord's Prayer, which are kind of interesting. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. And Babylonians had all kinds of animals. No wonder they needed a den of lions, but we don't have time for that. Whereas they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. Keep going. We're going to get to this in a little bit. We don't get any of this information now. We're going to get it in chapter 7. Chapter 8, chapter 11. I just kind of want to give you an outline so that we can get to it there. Keep going. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. All that we know is that the next kingdom is inferior. That's it. Anyone else that wants to add a whole bunch of other stuff out of chapter 2, it is not there. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom. Watch this. Strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and breaks and smashes things, so it crushes everything. And it's kind of interesting historically how that's exactly what Rome did, is they broke and crushed and smashed everything. Keep going. Just as you saw the feet and the toes were partly baked of clay and partly baked of iron. So this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, some iron mixed with clay. It's exactly what Rome was. It was a very strong, powerful kingdom that got dissolved from the inside out. The way Daniel describes it is exactly how Rome worked. In fact, this is so precise, and the other chapters are so precise, that people think there's no way that Daniel could have accurately predicted how all of this took place. So they say that there wasn't Daniel, someone that was in the 2nd century wrote way back trying to fill in the gaps. The problem is Daniel knew things that only someone in the 6th century knew. So it verifies that this is actually prophecy and God was fulfilling the future in advance, which makes us trust everything else he's about to say. As the toes are partly iron and partly clay, so is this kingdom will be partly strong, partly brittle. Just as you saw the iron mixed with the clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united, and the more iron that mixes with clay. And if you look at the history and see how Rome works, Rome fell apart at the seams, but there was parts of it that lasted, and it has become now what we call Western civilization, and that's the world that we live in. It's kind of the way that we think. There's some things that have lasted all the way till then, and that part's going to last if you go to Revelation, but we're going to go there a different day. Verse 44. In the times of those the king, and this is the part I've been wanting to get to, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or will never be left. And this is the first time in Daniel we're introduced to Jesus. And this is really cool because I love the images. And here's the images. You can go back and you can take some time to read it. We're officially just about out of time for today. But there's 3 images that are super cool in this one metaphor. The one is this rock. And the second one is a mountain, and the third one is chaff. And as we go and we see, and as we read forward and we look at the New Testament, the rock just happens to be Jesus. And God is laying out in the future, and he's saying that there's coming a time. And by the way, during the Roman Empire, does anyone know of someone who came into the world through a cave, in a manger, through a virgin, during the Roman Empire when Augustus Caesar was ruling? And I can imagine God saying, I'm going to throw down this rock, and it's going to be subtle, and it's going to hit it, and it's going to topple over the king, and it's going to become a mountain, and it's going to take over the entire world. It's going to be eternal. It's going to be secure. There'll never be anything like this kingdom, and no one will ever be able to undermine it. No one will ever be able to take over this king, because this king, the one that starts out as the rock, will become a mountain that engulfs the entire world. Let's keep going. We're going to skip down. I just wanted to make sure that we caught this from Luke. Watch what Jesus did, because he quotes Daniel, and he says this. He's telling the parable of the tenants. And remember in the parable of the tenants, there were these people that were renting out the property, and then they tried to get him to pay, and they killed the servants, and then they sent the son, and then they killed the son. And then Jesus looks at him, and he says these words, quoting Daniel, and watch what he says. Jesus looked directly at them, that's the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and he asked this question, then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected, that's going from Psalm 18 and Isaiah 29, has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken into pieces. Anyone who falls on it will be crushed. And Jesus is claiming right there that he is going to fulfill this prophecy in Daniel. Skip down to the next verses. Go ahead to the next. There we go. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel, and he paid him honor and ordered offering and incense be presented to him. You see, at the beginning, in chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't impressed with Daniel. He wasn't impressed with his God. The only thing that he was impressed with was Daniel's accomplishments and how that he was like smarter than everyone else. And all of a sudden, he gets to see this incredible God that knows the future. This incredible God that sees even into his own mind. He gets to see this incredible God that one day will take over every single thing. And watch what he does. And he gives Daniel honor and incense. He presents him. And the king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods, Lord of lords, and the revealer of mysteries. Nebuchadnezzar is acknowledging that it is the God of Israel who understands all of that stuff. We got 2 more slides. Go to the next one. How do you flourish when you find yourself in Babylon? I don't want us to miss the main point. Trust. History is not determined by human rulers, but by the God who has a glorious future planned. You see, it isn't about who gets elected, and it isn't about who's in the Supreme Court, because every single kingdom, including the United States of America, will ultimately one day come to ruin. And there is only one true king, and there's only one true kingdom that's going to last. And if we get that thought in our mind, it changes everything. And we're not worried about a pandemic. We're not worried about an election. And we're not worried about everything else that's going on, because someone who is in control of those who think they're in control is one day going to rule over everything. And it is not human ingenuity, and it's not wisdom. It is the God of the universe that is pulling everything together. Awareness that God is diligently working behind the scenes for the ones he passionately loves. You see, Daniel knew those two things. God's in control, and he cares about me. Do you know both of those? Remember I said at the very beginning of the sermon, if we allowed those two truths to get into our soul, it would change everything. Just watch how good God is, because watch how he ends the story. Then the king placed Daniel in the high position and lavished many gifts on him. And watch this. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon. Next week, we're going to talk about the province of Babylon as all of the outside things and all of the other kings and all of the other rulers. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators of the province of Babylon. Why? Daniel remained in the court, which might just explain to you as you read next week why Daniel wasn't there when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fire. As I close out, I want to leave you with two things. Do you know who's in control? And does the one who is in control care about you? Because both of those truths will change everything. And I'm hoping that you'd be willing to consider, just like Daniel, that there is a God. And not only is he powerful, but he isn't like the gods of Babylonians. He cares about ordinary, normal people like teenagers in exile. And people like you and me. Dear God, I pray that we would let the truth of Daniel chapter 2 sink into our souls. Give us the ability to trust and to live for you. God, you do honor those that honor you. And I pray that that's how we would act. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen. Go ahead and head to your groups. Those of you that are watching online, thanks for joining us.